When Miles Davis brought his own gold record to Antiques Roadshow in 1987, the expert took one look at it and declared it probably fake. What the expert didn't realize was that he was talking to the man who had actually earned that record through decades of revolutionary music. Miles' response to this humiliating moment revealed something profound about recognition, respect, and the assumptions people make about who deserves success. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in August 1987, and the popular PBS show Antiques Roadshow had set up their traveling appraisal event at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium. Hundreds of people had lined up with their treasured possessions, hoping to discover they owned something valuable or historically significant. Miles Davis, now 59 years old and in the later phase of his career, had decided to attend the event almost on a whim. He had been cleaning out his Malibu home and had come across his gold record for Kind of Blue, the 1959 album that many critics considered the greatest jazz recording of all time. The record had been sitting in a closet for years, gathering dust, and Miles was curious about its current value. Miles wasn't particularly interested in the money by 1987. He had achieved enough financial success to be comfortable for life. But there was something appealing about having his achievement officially recognized by experts, about having the significance of Kind of Blue acknowledged by people whose job it was to assess cultural value. As Miles stood in line with hundreds of other hopeful appraisers, he noticed the curious looks he was getting from the predominantly white middle-class crowd. Even in 1987, Miles Davis cut an unmistakable figure, tall, elegantly dressed, wearing his signature dark sunglasses, carrying himself with the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades commanding stages and recording studios. But to most of the people in that line, Miles was just another person hoping to cash in on some old memorabilia. They had no idea they were standing next to one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century. When Miles finally reached the memorabilia experts' table, he was greeted by Dr. Richard Whitman, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, who had built a reputation as one of the country's leading authorities on music collectibles. Whitman had been appraising musical artifacts for over 20 years and had appeared on Antiques Roadshow since the show's inception. Miles approached the table with quiet confidence, carrying the gold record in a simple cardboard box. The record itself was mounted in an elegant frame, with the familiar blue-tinted cover of Kind of Blue prominently displayed, alongside the gold certification from the Recording Industry Association of America. "Good afternoon," Dr. Whitman said with professional politeness. "What do you have for me today?" Miles set the box on the table and carefully removed the framed gold record. "This is a gold record for Kind of Blue," he said simply. "I was hoping you could tell me something about its value and authenticity." Dr. Whitman picked up the record and began examining it with the practiced eye of someone who had seen thousands of similar items. He studied the frame, the mounting, the certification plaque, and the record itself. But as he examined the item, his expression began to change from professional interest to skeptical concern. After several minutes of careful inspection, Dr. Whitman looked up at Miles with the kind of expression reserved for delivering disappointing news to hopeful sellers. "I'm afraid I have some concerns about this piece," Dr. Whitman said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that Antiques Roadshow viewers had come to expect. "While the craftsmanship is quite good, I'm seeing several indicators that suggest this is probably a reproduction rather than an authentic gold record." Miles felt a flash of surprise and irritation, but his face remained impassive behind his sunglasses. "What kind of indicators?" he asked quietly. Dr. Whitman turned the record so the cameras could capture it for the television audience. "Well, first of all, authentic gold records from the 1950s and 1960s were typically much more elaborate in their presentation. This seems rather simple for something that would have been awarded for such a significant achievement." Miles said nothing, but those who knew him could recognize the tightening around his eyes that indicated his patience was being tested. Dr. Whitman continued his assessment. "More importantly, Kind of Blue was a jazz album, and jazz albums from that era very rarely achieved gold record status. The market for jazz was much smaller than it is today, and the sales figures required for gold certification were quite difficult for jazz artists to achieve." The expert paused, looking directly at Miles with what he probably thought was gentle compassion. "I don't want to disappoint you, but my professional assessment is that this is most likely a well-made replica, probably created in the 1970s or 1980s when there was a market for this type of memorabilia. It might have some value as a tribute piece, but it's not an authentic award. The assessment hung in the air like an accusation. Dr. Whitman was essentially telling Miles Davis that his most celebrated achievement was fake, that the recognition he had earned through decades of innovative music was probably fraudulent memorabilia. Miles removed his sunglasses and looked directly at Dr. Whitman. The expert suddenly found himself staring into the penetrating eyes that had intimidated music industry executives, challenged critics, and commanded respect from musicians around the world. "Dr. Whitman," Miles said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I need to ask you something. Do you know who I am?" The question caught Dr. Whitman off guard. He had been focused on the object, not the person bringing it for appraisal. He looked at Miles more carefully, trying to place him. "I'm sorry," Dr. Whitman said. "Should I?" "My name is Miles Davis," Miles replied simply. "And that gold record you just called fake? I earned it." The words hit Dr. Whitman like a physical blow. Suddenly, he understood exactly who was standing in front of him, one of the most important musicians in American history, the man who had created the very album whose authenticity he had just questioned. Miles continued speaking, his voice remaining calm but carrying decades of authority and hard-won respect. "I didn't bring this here to prove anything to you or to anyone else. I brought it because I was curious about its current value. But since you've decided to question whether I deserved it, let me tell you how I earned that recognition." The Antiques Roadshow cameras continued rolling, capturing what would become one of the most powerful moments in the show's history. "I recorded Kind of Blue in 1959, Miles said. "It took 2 recording sessions, March 2nd and April 22nd, at Columbia Studios in New York. The musicians were Bill Evans and Wynton Kelly on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, Jimmy Cobb on drums, John Coltrane and Julian Cannonball Adderley on saxophone, and me on trumpet." Dr. Whitman sat in stunned silence as Miles continued. "We didn't use written arrangements. I gave the musicians some sketches and scales, and we created that music through pure improvisation. It was a completely new approach to jazz recording, and it changed how musicians thought about harmony and improvisation." Miles paused, letting that sink in. "That album didn't just go gold, Dr. Whitman. It became the best-selling jazz album of all time. It's been in print continuously for nearly 30 years. It influenced musicians in every genre, not just jazz. Rock musicians study it. Classical composers reference it. It's in the Library of Congress." The expert's face was growing redder with each word, as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "But you want to know the most important thing about that record?" Miles asked. "I didn't just record it and walk away. I spent 40 years building on what we created in those sessions. I kept pushing music forward, kept taking risks, kept refusing to repeat myself just because something was successful." Miles picked up the gold record and held it in his hands. "You said jazz albums from that era rarely achieved gold status. You're right. Do you know why mine did? Because I refused to make music that stayed safely within the boundaries of what people expected from jazz. I made music that spoke to people across all kinds of barriers, racial, cultural, generational." The audience that had gathered around the appraisal table was completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "This gold record represents more than just sales figures," Miles continued. "It represents the courage to create something completely new. It represents hours of practice that started when I was 13 years old. It represents the respect I earned from other musicians by never accepting good enough." Miles looked directly at Dr. Whitman. "You assumed this record was fake because you couldn't imagine that the man standing in front of you could have earned it. But that says more about your assumptions than it does about my achievements." Dr. Whitman finally found his voice. "Mr. Davis, I sincerely apologize. I had no idea. I should have recognized. This is clearly an authentic and extremely valuable piece." But Miles wasn't finished making his point. "Dr. Whitman, I don't need you to authenticate my achievements. That record is real because I made the music it represents. Every note on that album came from years of dedication to my craft. Every song represents a choice to push boundaries rather than play it safe." Miles put his sunglasses back on, a signal that the conversation was essentially over. The value of this record isn't determined by what some expert thinks it's worth at an antique show. Its value comes from the fact that musicians are still learning from that music nearly 30 years later. Its value comes from the fact that it opened doors for other artists to take their own creative risks. The lesson Miles was delivering extended far beyond the specific situation. He was talking about earned respect, about the assumptions people make based on appearance, about the difference between recognition and achievement. "I've spent my entire career proving that I deserved to be where I was," Miles said. "Not because I wanted anyone's permission, but because excellence requires that level of commitment. Every time I walked onto a stage, every time I went into a recording studio, I had to prove that I belonged there." Miles looked around at the crowd that had gathered to witness this exchange. "But here's what I learned. When you've truly earned something, you don't need external validation. This gold record would be just as meaningful to me if no expert ever authenticated it, because I know what it represents. I know the work that went into creating it." Dr. Whitman made another attempt at professional recovery. "Mr. Davis, I hope you understand that my initial assessment was purely based on the physical characteristics of the piece. I would never question your extraordinary contributions to music." Miles nodded slightly, accepting the apology but making it clear that the damage had already revealed something important. "The problem, Dr. Whitman, isn't that you made a mistake about this specific record. The problem is the assumption that led to the mistake. You looked at me and decided I didn't fit your idea of who earns gold records. That assumption is what made you doubt the authenticity of my achievement." The broader implications of what had happened were becoming clear to everyone present. This wasn't just about a gold record or a television show. It was about the prejudices and assumptions that determine who gets recognized for their achievements and who has to constantly prove they deserve what they've earned. "I've been dealing with those assumptions my entire career," Miles continued. "People who couldn't believe that a black musician could be innovative and commercially successful at the same time. People who thought jazz wasn't sophisticated enough to be taken seriously as art. People who assumed that success meant selling out rather than reaching new audiences." Miles picked up his gold record and placed it back in its box. "But every time someone questioned whether I deserved what I had achieved, it reminded me why the work itself mattered more than the recognition, that music will outlast both of us." Dr. Whitman. "Long after this television show is forgotten, musicians will still be studying Kind of Blue and learning from it." As Miles prepared to leave the appraisal table, he offered one final observation. "The next time someone brings you something they claim to have achieved, maybe ask them to tell you how they earned it before you decide whether they look like someone who deserves success. You might learn something about both the object and the person." The Antiques Roadshow cameras captured Miles Davis walking away from the table with quiet dignity, carrying his authenticated gold record and leaving behind a television moment that would be remembered long after the show aired. Dr. Whitman sat in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. In the span of 15 minutes, he had gone from confidently dismissing a piece of memorabilia to receiving a masterclass in achievement, recognition, and respect from one of America's greatest artists. The incident became one of the most talked about moments in Antiques Roadshow history, not because of the monetary value revealed, but because of the powerful lesson about earned success and the assumptions that can blind us to greatness. Miles Davis had once again proven that true achievement doesn't require external validation. It speaks for itself through the work, the innovation, and the lasting impact on those who experience it. If this incredible story of earned respect and recognition battles inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that true achievement comes from the work itself, not from other people's recognition of it. Have you ever had to prove you deserve something you had clearly earned? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out more stories about the moments when legends had to defend their greatness.